For many of us, our spiritual life has been shaped by the pressure to produce and to keep a certain pace. But what if the truest mark of a flourishing soul isn't found in how much we can crank out, but in the quiet, slow, attentive work happening in organic rhythms and seasons? The secret to a fruitful life isn't found in trying harder, but in learning to abide. Hi, friends. I'm Jem Fadling, and welcome to the Unhurried Living podcast, where we inspire you to rest deeper, live fuller, and lead better. Today, I'm diving headfirst into the vineyards of John 15 with artist and author Bette Dickinson. The invitation to remain in the vine is one of our most central, and I know you'll learn much from my conversation with Bette. Today, I'm joined by Bette Dickinson, author, artist, and contemplative guide, whose new book, The Art of Vine Making, is a fresh invitation into the ancient wisdom of John 15, abiding in the true vine. Bette brings us insights from the vineyard, where the vine dresser's chief concern isn't productivity, but flourishing. Together, we'll explore what it looks like to move from a culture of relentless output to a life rooted in abiding, belonging, and slow transformation. In our conversation, you'll hear about God as the loving vine dresser, whose primary concern is our well-being and growth, the difference between an industrial productivity approach and a flourishing organic approach to faith, and what we can learn from the natural seasons as reflected in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The lessons of John 15 are the center of the bullseye for us here at Unhurried Living, so I know you'll enjoy my conversation with Bette. If you only buy one book this year, get this one, because the centrality of the conversation is critical. Let's dive in. Well, Bette Dickinson, welcome to the Unhurried Living podcast. Thanks for saying yes.
Yay, I'm so excited to be here with you. Can't wait.
I know. Well, Bette and I are newer friends, but I did just have a chance to see her in the summer. I went to Michigan for the first time, and we had a chance to go out to dinner. So it was really fun to meet in person. Well, we met in person last year in Wichita, right? The first time.
Yeah, but it was nice to have you in my hometown this time.
It's still a little different, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, and no one who listens will be surprised by this. We're talking about John 15 today. There isn't hardly a time that goes by where I don't get to mention John 15, because I just really believe it's a central teaching of Jesus. It's a central invitation, and actually it's a reality. And so what I think often we're just not tuned into the reality of we're just the branch and there's this vine, and we're going to talk about all this. So I can't be more excited to talk about your book, because I told Bette, I think I told you this when I saw you, that you wrote the book that I would have written.
Sorry,
Except, I know it would have, it didn't occur to me, and no one asked me, so I haven't written it. But if I were to write one, it would be very similar to yours, I would hope. Different stories, of course, because we're different people, but the heart of what you're trying to do just resonated so deeply. So I just want to start by saying thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for reading it and endorsing the book. And yeah, I'm honored.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, let's dive in. Actually, I want to start kind of right where you started in the book.
Yeah.
You start with a quote from your vine dresser, Dave, who I'm sure will come up many times during this conversation. But I'm going to read this quote, and then I just want you to talk about this. What does this mean?
Sure.
It says, "It's not that they, the vine dressers, don't care about the fruit," he continued. This is Dave talking. "It's just that by that point, their work is already done. All that matters to good vine dressers is the health, quality, and vitality of their vines. If they pay attention to those things, good fruit will be the natural byproduct." And then you commented right after that in your book, the vine dresser's primary concern isn't fruit, it's flourishing. I know. Talk to me about this. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Well, when I came into that conversation, I was in full-time ministry, and I was just like you, had a deep fascination around John 15. It had been a life passage for me as well. And I had the chance to meet an actual vine dresser. And so I just had so many questions around how does a vine dresser help a vine to become fruitful? And what does that even look like? And what is fruit in Jesus's terms? And so when he said that vine dressers actually don't pay much attention to the fruit, they pay attention to the health, quality, and vitality of the vines, I was dumbfounded. Because in ministry contexts, a lot of times, and I think in our culture, a lot of times, when we think of fruitfulness, we think of production, we think of measurable outcomes, we think of growth. And I thought that's all ministry is about, is the fruit. But in reality, as I've, journeyed alongside of Dave over the last 6 years, I've been through many vintages and harvests, watching the grapes finally, turn into being able to harvest fruit. It's a longer process, and that harvest is just a couple weeks. And yet I think we have this sort of outsized picture of what fruit or harvest time looks like. I think in our culture and in the ministry context that I was in, I was burning out over feeling like it's always harvest time. I've always got to be reaping something. It's always time for the harvest. And the reality is, in the life of the vine, that's just not true. That fruitfulness is this overflow of a long journey, of a cyclical rhythm, and for vines, even many years before they actually are able to yield quality fruit, that they have to build a root structure beneath the soil that takes many years to grow. And so that one comment, that one conversation just reshaped the way I view the spiritual life and really led me on this journey of exploration of what does that even mean? And what does it mean to be tended by a vine dresser who cares for the health, quality, and vitality of his vines, that is deeply relational, deeply attentive, and not just about the harvest season, but is about all the seasons and years that lead up to that point.
So good. Can you say a little bit more on that, just about the word flourishing?
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So flourishing for me is more of a reflection on the long view that God takes with us. And that, for Dave, even when he's pruning, he's thinking 2 or 3 years ahead, and will often remove fruit so that the vine can be healthy. And so flourishing for me is sort of this bigger picture understanding around what is the vitality, the life that God wants us to have, that is healed, that is whole, that is deeply rooted, that follows the seasons, that isn't just about one stage of the cycle, but sees every part of the life, death, resurrection cycle of the vine as an essential part to become the fullness of what a vine was created to be. And so flourishing, in my perspective, is really about the vine dresser's deep, tender care of the vine, that it would be more than just fruitful, but that it would be long-term, sustainable, and healthy and whole.
Even we're going to get into this later. We're going to talk about Jesus and his the seasonality of the model that he lived, died, and resurrected. But even as you're talking right now, I'm realizing the Father and the Son connection, because in John 15 it says, "My Father is the vine dresser," right?
Mm.
I am the vine.
Mm-hmm.
You are the branch. And so it's interesting to think about this in terms of the vine dresser. The vine dresser is God. God is caring for the vine, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jesus is breathing life into us, then, I guess, if we're the branches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very organic, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about loving union with Jesus, to a certain degree, it's like trying to separate the branches from the vine. If you're trying to think of which one is us and which one is Jesus, like to the certain degree, like you look at it and it's all together. It's all one.
Right.
I think that was the point Jesus was trying to make, is that you and I are one. We're a part of this thing. My life is in your life and your life is in my life. And actually, even this symbiotic relationship between the branches and the vine is just fascinating. Like, in spring, the roots push energy up to the branches for bud break. So bud break kind of comes from the roots. But then when the leaves come out and flatten out, then they send the energy from the sun back down into the vine, into the roots. And so there's this constant conversation going back and forth. But I think the essence of it is that it's all one, it's all interconnected, it's all relationally there.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's a critical conversation when it comes to being a Christian and being a community, a Christian community.
Right.
Because you bring in very clearly the idea of, maybe it's a contrast between productivity driven and what you would call, I think, the flourishing approach. Can you talk about those two in relation to each other?
Yeah. So it's a framework that I set up in the book just to try to address, I think, some of the dissonance between what we see in our culture. And I think especially since the Industrial Revolution, where, we treat ourselves, we treat the land, we treat one another often like machines for an output. And I think even in a capitalistic society, it's sort of, like going to get the best, most efficient product out. And I think we tend to take that view because we're so surrounded by it and look towards God with that approach. But that's actually not how good vine dressers tend their vines. And this was a lot of the unlearning that I had to do, was learning as I watched Dave, who's an organic vine dresser. And his approach is very relational. And his approach really, I believe, in how he's listening to the rhythms of creation. He's responding to the vine. He loves the vine. I mean, he's never in a hurry to try to rush it on towards fruit. He deeply cares and is constantly giving the vine attention and responding to its needs. And so I think, watching Dave along these several vintages has helped me see a different picture of who God is, that he's not a boss who's trying to put the squeeze on us for more buckets of fruit.
Right.
The flourishing approach is this approach that is more about quality than quantity, which is a huge thing in grapevines. I think we tend to think a lot more is better, but not in a grapevine, not when you're trying to make a nice bottle of wine. And I think for us, just for me, especially needing to take a step back and see, how is God tending me lovingly, slowly, intentionally, and isn't so concerned about my outputs, but is more concerned about who I'm becoming in him. And am I, over time, becoming more deeply engrafted into the true vine? Am I becoming more like an expression of the vine in the world? And that's not something you muster up. That's not something you strive to do. It's not something you have to flex your muscles in order to accomplish. It's something that just ripens naturally out of a good and healthy relationship of attachment between the vine and the branches.
Yeah. There's a word that's been popping up recently. It's kind of a spiritual formation, spiritual direction word that I think gets at what you're saying. It's the word consent.
Mm.
That because you said, I'm not pushing, I'm not trying to make this happen. I can't make it happen. But there's a consenting to remaining. There's an openness to what God is providing. And everything you just mentioned is completely countercultural. So maybe we could talk about that for a minute, how hard this is, because it's easy for us to sit here and wax eloquent about John 15. I get that. But we both live in the United States, which has a culture. Yep. It's very revved up. It's very materialistic, productivity oriented, goal oriented, fast moving in a lot of areas, a lot of locations. And so do you have any, I don't know, ideas or guidance? How would a person either start or continue to lean into this countercultural way that is about flourishing?
Good question. Well, that's what the whole book is about. Honestly,
that's
truly,
true.
It's been,
well, just give us the 2-minute version, and then we don't have to buy it.
No. So, a lot of the book, honestly, is me trying to figure that out. Oh, wait, okay, and this, when you are transforming a worldview, I really do think this is a worldview shift. That's not something you can do overnight, And so I've been working at this for 6 years, and I still feel like, especially right now while I'm getting ready to release this book into the world, like, Lord, help me do this from a flourishing approach and not a productivity driven approach that would just push me so hard. And I think one is recognizing, where does that tendency show up in our lives and where are the roots of it? Going back to that imagery of recognizing as an achiever. So I'm an Enneagram 3, for anybody in the audience who's familiar with the Enneagram. Enneagram 3s are achievers, and I think I had to recognize how much of my identity I had put into my work and my achievements. And so really the book actually begins with a sabbatical, a 6-month sabbatical that I took in 2020 that really began to release and surrender my striving and trying to seek after my worth and identity based on my achievements, and to back up and see, where did that take root in my life? What are the parts of my story where I felt like I had to, this is who I am, this is what I have to do to belong, and to hear God's truth speak into, what were the lies I was believing about myself, so that I could actually hear the truth and receive the truth that God loves me for who I am, not for what I do. And that also He's not putting expectations on me that I think the world often does, which is I've always have to have something to show for myself, and to really spend time truly, for me, abiding in Jesus and learning that happened a lot through the creative process, where as an artist, I had to spend a lot of time releasing, striving for a product, and just delight in communing with Jesus in the creative process without any expectation or result, but just simply to say, I want to just surrender and to be with you, to play, to experience and to encounter you, Jesus, in this love that holds me and deeply connects with me apart from whatever outcome I'm producing. And so, I think that's part of it. I think also part of it is embracing seasonal rhythms, which I think our culture just doesn't do. I think in our modern world, where we have electricity and we can operate on our computers at all hours of night, and we can stay up late and, just sort of go without much of a break. And even our vacations are, packed with activities. I think one thing that I've had to really embrace, and I've had the luxury to be able to put this into my schedule as I make my own schedule. And I know that not everybody has that luxury, but finding ways to say, okay, how do I live in a cyclical rhythm like the vine? What are the times in my year that can be more like a dormancy, where I'm intentionally setting time aside to rest, to stop, to let go of the striving? And I think when we withdraw into times of solitude and silence and rest, those are the spiritual practices that I know that you work on a lot with Unhurried Living. Is it takes that removal from the work and stopping and resting to remember our identity attached from the work, and to allow God to cultivate our roots, to lead us back into healing and to lead us back into the nourishment that could then, in seasons of spring, can show itself later.
I want to actually go there a little bit more about seasons, because I think being reminded about our organic seasonal nature is good. So I want to talk about that. But before we do that, I just want to back up, talking about your Enneagram. I'm not an Enneagram 3, and yet I still have my own sort of American tendencies. There's that overlay that we all probably have on ourselves, no matter what our personality or tendencies or motivations are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do, in fact, know your Enneagram number, though, there's probably something in your way that's keeping you still from making this shift to this worldview that Betty's talking about. And so just even being mindful of your own tendencies that keep you from, again, I'm probably overusing the word organic, but I can't think of another word. I like the word organic because it feels like we live very much more in like a machine world. Obviously, I have all the products. Here they are. I've got microphones and computers. So just remembering I'm a living, breathing organism that is more like one of the trees in my backyard than my phone, right?
Right.
And so, because of that, it would be good for me to intentionally craft my life as best I can in the life that I'm actually living to think seasonally. So, maybe can you unpack for us briefly what would it look like for me to think of myself in spring, summer, fall, and winter?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and the seasons of the vine, the framework that's been helpful for me is thinking about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and that seeing the seasons sort of through that lens, because I think sometimes maybe people have a dissonance around seasons, or maybe feel like, is that really like a Christian, like, is that a Christian invitation? And truthfully, I mean, Paul says, I want to know Christ and his sufferings. And so somehow attaining to the measure of the resurrection, and that there's this invitation into Jesus's life that is this cyclical rhythm of life, death, resurrection. And so when I think about seasons of abiding in Christ's death, I think this is the time just after harvest where the grapes are at the winery. And what I learned from Dave, my Vinedresser friend, is that at that point, the leaves channel all the remaining energy that they have. They're no longer channeling the energy into ripening grapes, they're channeling the energy into the roots. And so there's this transition that happens from the energy going to ripening grapes to the roots. And I think that that's a transition that we need to learn from the fruits to the roots, from light to darkness, from sort of out in the world engaged into solitude, into stillness. And so seasons starting from post-harvest through dormancy, even to pruning, are all seasons of surrender. The vine is surrendering its fruit, surrendering the leaves, surrendering to rest and dormancy. And I think, especially for me right now, in a harvest season, I'm thinking about, this is not sustainable, and I'm going to need to set up in my schedule a time where I'm channeling that energy back down into the roots where I can withdraw and rest. And so I've already put in my schedule, after this book is launched, in January, I take January off to just slow down, to reconnect. And so those are seasons. And sometimes those seasons come upon us not necessarily at the end of harvest because we've been working so hard, but often they come when we've experienced a loss or failure or an ending of some kind, where it takes time to let go of that, whatever that fruit is, and attachment to that, and to then reconnect and to grieve and to lament and to pray and to reconnect and heal. And that's what the vine does, truly during dormancy too, is it's spending the time healing. And then, you go through all of that and hit pruning, and pruning is this like time of reorientation towards what's setting the intention for the vine. Where is the vine going to channel its energy next? And so Dave tells me, he's like, it's the most foundational part in the life cycle of the vine, because he takes 90% of the branches off and just choosing 2 or 3 to invest. Yeah, that's a huge shift, right? And so I think,
wow,
yeah, there's this time of transition of letting go of where the harvest came from before, and where is God inviting us next. And so I think, coming out of a season of winter or out of a season of dormancy, we need to be thinking about not just sort of mindlessly going into a new thing, but saying, God, where do you want me to position my energy next? And surrendering and seeking his guidance in that. And then so that when the resurrection life comes, when that burst of energy comes back, and that surge of starting at a new job or starting in a new, role in your life, like becoming a parent or starting a new job or a curriculum, these are all new beginnings that are like spring, that we need to then allow the energy to come from the roots within us, and the creativity and the inspiration that bursts forth with new life. And then sort of this resurrection season is actually where we turn from solitude to community, and to understanding what is our belonging in the community of leavers, and where are our gifts showing up? How can we welcome and create a sense of belonging for others, but also where are we welcomed and can show up in our most true and authentic selves? And then it's really experimenting, exploring that in community, and then seasons of Christ's life are where we then ripen the fruit of the kingdom. And, just to remind our listeners, because I need to be reminded this also, when Jesus talked about fruit, it wasn't tangible. It wasn't necessarily a physical product, right? Which sometimes it can be, like an overflow of our truest self often shows up in tangible ways. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And those are the things that show up when we ripen the fruit of the kingdom, that we turn towards what I would say in the book. I talk about how we shift from, if in the winter months, in the death of Christ is about our belovedness in God, the resurrection is around our belonging in community, then the life of Christ is about blessing the world. So it's ripening out of that community to be a blessing that is given away. And the vine shifts from growing to then ripening fruit that is given away. And so I think there's also that shift then intentionally towards others, those that are on the outside, those that are not feeling like they belong. And there's a sense of justice in the kingdom of God when it comes to harvest that shows up in this cycle as well, which is then, it's just a reflection on, okay, if this is the life of Christ, how did Christ live? What did that look like? And so we would, to ripen the fruit of the kingdom is to be like the image of Jesus in the world, which, as St. Teresa of Avila says, Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the hands at which he blesses the whole world. And so, looking at the way that we express that in community into the world as an offering.
Good. Oh my goodness, there's so much there. I don't know where to start. So let's go backwards from where you just were. So something that stood out was the fruit of the Spirit. Sure, there will be, Jesus talks in John 15 about much fruit that lasts. Mm-hmm. And again, as you said, it could be, things that we do, how we bless others or do things, but there's also the fruit of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine if we were more concerned with nurturing a life where those things were emerging naturally? I mean, of course, other good works, if you want to call it that, good production would happen, but it sounds like we're talking about our character here. That's right. Being shaped as a human being and how impactful that would be.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I think one of the things I had to think about and learned from Dave is that the fruit, part of how they find out that it's ready is the condition of the seed. If the seed is crunchy and it's like a certain maturity of the seed, that's when it's ready. But the seed's not going to be taken to do what it's supposed to do unless the fruit is sweet and desirable. And I think, we carry the seed of the word, right? We carry the seed of the kingdom within us. But how that seed is presented matters, because the seed is not going to be planted if a bird thinks the fruit is rotten. And I think what we're seeing right now...
Stop right there, right?
Let's just be honest. When we look at the church right now, we're in a really rotten crisis where we're seeing a lot of the fruit is rotten, and no wonder people are spitting it out. No wonder people are leaving the church in droves if there's, sexual abuse scandals and division and, all the things that we're seeing in this moment right now.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, it's really sobering to think about, do our faith communities carry the flavor of the kingdom? Do they look like the fruit of the Spirit? Or do they look like the works of the flesh that Paul talks about in that same passage, which is discord, jealousy, envy, sexual immorality, all these things. And that fruit, again, doesn't change right away either. it comes from the roots.
Stay on that track for a moment. The idea of talking about our Christian communities, because yeah, you're right. There is a crisis. I mean, all the time in some news place, there is someone being called out, some major leader being called
Mhm.
out for some horrible behavior. So I wonder, in light of that, can we return to this idea of organic farming and industrialized farming?
Mm.
You talk about that, and thinking of the close connection with the vine dresser to the vine. Ideally, then, couldn't we talk about the pastor's connection to the people's spiritual formation?
Mhm.
Right,
Absolutely.
the farming. I think one of the words you talked about in the book was exhaustion. The industrialized model actually leads the ground to exhaustion, and sometimes it can even make it so that it can't produce anymore. I've heard of that before as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
And so all of this that Betty and I are talking about is how we can take the actual farming idea and bring it over into our lives.
Mhm.
And so I guess my question would be, what would it look like for Christian communities to transition from an industrialized model, which we might call McChurch,
Yep.
right? To maybe a slower contemplative farming of souls. I mean, I have ideas about this. I'll just throw out before you answer.
Mm.
I think one reason we don't make the transition is we don't want to take the time because it gets in the way of whatever we're thinking productivity is. Like we wouldn't be able to stop train because caring for souls is messy and slow and absolutely unmanageable.
Oh, yeah.
And so, yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about all that.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. I mean, I think, one thing that's been fascinating to me learning about some of the differences, I lay out this one of the columns or graphics in the book is this chart between the flourishing approach and the productivity driven approach. And, one is quality over quantity, like we talked about. And so, what does the quality of our relationships look like? Are they transactional? Or are they about belovedness and belonging? Are they about more than what we're doing? I mean, I don't know, I'm sure, Jem, you've been in situations where you're in a community of some kind that the focus is all about what you're producing or who are you bringing or how is it growing instead of what is the relational quality of our connection to one another and our connection to God, and uh, not about the numbers. It's not about how many people are in the room. It's not about how much we're doing or producing, but it's who we're becoming, which you said that's harder to measure. That's like trying to measure the way that a flavor of wine tastes, right? You can tell that there's a difference, but you can't quite
Mhm.
put your finger on it. And so that's one thing. I think the other thing that was fascinating to me is I think about the differences between a flourishing approach versus a productivity driven approach is this concept of terroir, which terroir is a French word for a sense of place. And it's the understanding that the surrounding environment really shapes how the vine grows, the climate, the landscape, the soil, even the care of the vine dresser. And that each place that we're planted, a vine is a unique expression of that place. But I think when, as you said, I don't know what the exact term you use, but McChurch, right? So
Oh,
just like
yeah.
McDonald's or Starbucks that's trying to produce the exact same expression, for profitability and scale, it has to be the same. The sense of terroir is the exact opposite. It's saying, actually, we want to allow the sense of the surrounding community, what has shaped us, our gifts, our family of origin, all of the things that form us into who we were created to be. Those should have a unique and beautiful expression in the fruit. But if we are trying to go for scale, we flatten that because it's not efficient, right? And so a lot of times we try to churn out the same style of disciple or to grow something large, but the depth and the quality and the uniqueness of that expression is lost. And so I think that does take a lot more work and it's smaller scale. And to be quite honest, I mean, Dave, in the vines that he tends, because he's so relational, because he's so intentional about quality over quantity and in the uniqueness of each vine being expressed, he makes smaller batches of wine because that allows him to then use the creativity and that unique expression of that fruit. And so I think sometimes, and I think we're seeing this draw more towards this now as we're seeing some megachurches begin to explode, is to recognize that sometimes if you want the truest expression to come forth, it needs to be smaller scale and it needs to be intentional and it needs to be deeply rooted. And you can't get that in a large production, and I think that the emphasis is on where's the fruit coming from and how is it being cultivated and how do we cultivate fruit in ways that is an overflow of these relationships, of these quality relationships, as opposed to the end result. And just to give a tangible example, because this sometimes can be like, well, how? There's a really good book. I don't know if you've read it, called Rare Leadership by Jim Wilder and Marcus Warner. And he talks about in leadership, there's often two different targets that leaders go after. The first target that they go after is results, which would be, sort of figuring out what's the biggest profit, what's the largest, impact that we can make. And when your main priority is results, then it can create a toxic culture where people are used up for the sake of the end result. But he said that there's another target that leaders approach, which is much more unusual, though not unheard of, which is called growing a group identity or building a group identity, which is who are we and what is it like us to act? And that actually is an operation out of the right side of the brain, which is our relational connections, our attachments to one another, even our experiences in the body. And he said, actually, interestingly enough, leaders who put that as the target first, so growing a group identity, creating a sense of safety and belonging of we are in this together, actually ends up getting good results. It's just the overflow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this would be like Jesus, right? Who Jesus wasn't interested in just growing massive crowds. We see multiple times in his ministry that people left because of his teaching, but it was cultivating not workhorses for the kingdom, but friends, or things, people like Mother Teresa, she wasn't interested in this large thing, but she said, I'm going to go and serve those that are the most vulnerable and the poor, and I'm going to tend to each individual, but that was so inspiring. So many people have, joined that movement. So there are examples of that, but I think it is a very countercultural way. And it does take a lot of intentionality and trust that when we go in this approach, the fascinating thing is that when you put that target first, people understand that excellence is just being a part of who we are. And you bring out the best in people in that culture, as opposed to sort of putting kind of a strain on them to push out something that then it robs the joy in the work.
I think there's a simplicity here. There at the center, then, of course, why is the great commandment the great commandment? Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. I think at the center of what you're talking about is really just love.
Right.
Mother Teresa would say, love the person in front of you.
Yeah.
Go home and love your family.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because I've done this before in my own way, just trying to build unhurried living. And I've shared this before on podcasts and videos, just that siren call of ambition, like, oh, we need a following and people need to know we're there because you're building an organization. It's very easy to get just off over here into the industrialized machine. Mm-hmm. But then to pivot back, it's about people, it's about love. And Dallas Lord, I think, would use the word indirection is one of the things you're talking about. There's an indirection there when you're talking about group identity and that building something and that overflowing. You didn't directly go after whatever it was, but you did something that automatically made it happen. I just think all of those movements, though, are, again, they're counterintuitive. They take a long time. They're messy. It takes patience. I mean, there's a lot of things here that you could see why people wouldn't do it naturally, because there's a lot of little doors that close and you say, I have to have patience and I have to wait and I have to discern. And
Yeah.
there's a
Mhm.
there's a whole thing there. I mean, I went to a it was a conference for a big deal conference. And when they introduced one of the speakers, it was just a laundry list of how he grew this thing to that, from 20 people to 5,000 people. And he's
Mhm.
a part of this thing. And it's got this many. It's so, and isn't that common though, to just
Oh,
hear
yeah.
the numbers? Like we're the how many times have you heard we're the fastest growing church? And
Oh, yeah.
how many, everybody evidently is, because I hear it all the time. And how do you even know what that means? What does that even mean?
Good point.
What does that mean? I mean, it sounds good, the fastest. That makes sense. I guess what I'm trying to just say is it's exhausting, though, to stay on that version of the treadmill. And as you were talking about this industrialization, it really does kill the soil over time. Someone is going to get exhausted. How many people are burnt out, either
Mhm.
in ministry or in the church? And the soil is just going to become unusable.
Right.
So I don't know, help me out here, Betty. how can we how can we continue to change our worldview?
Well, yeah, it takes practice, right? And I think
Yeah,
that it's not something that again happens overnight, but
yeah.
I think where it has to come first is knowing and believing in our bones that we are beloved.
Mm-hmm.
And when you know that you're beloved, then the overflow of that belovedness is not needing to strive or prove your belonging or belovedness because you already have it, right? So then when you're receiving that from God, then that becomes an overflow into how you treat others. And, one of the fascinating things, even just learning from Dave, and Andy Crouch talks a lot about this in his book too, but is this idea of contemplation versus exploitation.
Mm.
And how I think one thing is receiving the fact that God contemplates us and beholds us without any intention or desire for our usefulness to Him, but simply because we're beloved. And when we can receive that belovedness from Him, then we can then turn towards others and receive their belovedness apart from their usefulness to us. Right. And so, but you have to keep coming back to that because constantly our world is telling us that's not, you can't be beloved based on just being you. There's lots of, you got to have that list in the fastest growing church. And, so I think that's one thing. And I think I've seen models of it and examples of it. And I think one is just, it's the intentionality around the cultures that we're creating where we are. Are we creating a culture that others feel a sense of belonging and a sense of belovedness apart from their performance? Or are we attaching sort of conditional belonging based on you signing up to be a small group leader or
Right.
even sharing the love that we have with others or our time with others based on what they can do for us? Those are big things, and I'm really grateful that I've become a part of a community. I've talked to you about this before with my friend Danielle Strickland called Boundless. And I don't know that I would be able to learn any of this without experiencing it in a community, that it actually is possible, that it's actually possible to have a community that is a sense of belonging. And it's really being a part of a community that lives this way has helped me to unlearn it. And some of that has just been things like, when I have a mentor who's been working with me on my role in this community, which is our Infinitum Prayer Days that you've been a part of in the past, I kept going about it in this sort of striving approach, like, okay, we gotta, grow this, or we gotta do these X amount of things. And she could tell that it was burning me out. And instead of sort of just continuing to push the gas, she said, hold on, I can tell that this is not healthy for you. And what do we need to do to change what you're taking on or your responsibilities, and literally tangibly walking through what my expectations were of myself and shifting those to a different way. I was saying, like, let's focus on the relationships of the people on your team. That's priority number one, and the other things, your responsibilities or the outputs, those will follow. But and she described it like it's like tending a garden, right? I'm not a huge gardener myself. I wish I were, but it's a very forgiving place. You invest these things, and it's this kind of mystery of how things grow. And you're not after, right? You don't plant a seed sort of expecting like tomorrow there's going to be a tree with fruit on it. You go in expecting like, I'm just doing this because I love to do it. And I'm going to go about it in ways that tend and care and water. And then you just sort of get to step back and watch it grow. And so I think that the shift is often like we just talked about, the end result that we're going after, right? And even the means of the kingdom are just as important as what we're going for. And the means of the kingdom is love. It's the means, it's the method, and it's the result. That every part of it.
Yeah. Again, just the simplicity of the centrality of love. There's actually a quote in your book that I think goes with what you were just talking about with Jesus. So you said, Jesus tells us here that wherever we put down our roots, we can find belonging when we are held continually by him, the true vine. People of God are no longer tied to a particular territory, but to the person of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gets at what you were just talking about with identity and belonging. There's a true connection here. We spoke of at the very beginning. There's a vine dresser and there's a vine, and we're invited to remain, to abide. And as you said, you can't even tell. It's one plant. I mean, sure, I can go to the plant and you can see the point where the branch comes off of the vine, and you could identify that. But it's still just one thing. And so that centrality of union and connection, so beautiful. I want to back up for a minute and go back. This is a question of curiosity, maybe learning from Dave, because I know there's such a thing called pruning. I also know, because I've been to a vineyard before with a vine dresser, and he talked about thinning. They take the grapes off. So all that to say, I'm curious. You said Dave takes off 90% of the branches. So maybe there's a two-sided question. One would be, how does he know which ones to take off, and how does he know which ones to leave? And what does that say for our lives?
Ooh, that's good. Well, the pruning that I'm talking about with the 90% removal, that happens at the very start of the growing season. And so that would be spring pruning. And typically what it is, at least in the style of pruning that Dave does, and there's lots of different versions of vine dressing, so I don't want to presume that it's the same everywhere, but basically there's the canes, are sort of the branches that grow up to the trellis, and only 2 of those will remain that he'll then lay down on the trellis. That will be the main branches where the rest of the shoots will come up from. And so for him, it's then intentionally choosing, I think, in terms of the shape of the vine, what's the shape that this needs to take, and then taking off, what isn't going to actually yield fruit or help, which, he said a lot of times when he works with novice vine dressers, they don't take enough because they're worried about the what ifs. Like, what if I need that branch later? What if it doesn't produce fruit, or what if it doesn't grow, and the thing that had been a mindset shift for me as I think about the spiritual life is pruning is a trust of the internal vitality of what's within in the vine, and trusting that when we let go of where we grew before, God has a new vitality that's always, it's limitless. Like, even after pruning and taking 90% of the vine, he said, I'll still need to come back. And this is where the thinning comes in later. Thin out when it's grown, up to the trellis and it's wild, then he'll have to thin even more and take more away. But it's trusting that the things that I thought once served me well, maybe the opportunities in the past that I had really leaned on, the ways that I had grown in the past, God wants to do a new thing in every vintage. And so trusting that there's only, two areas of focus maybe that I can. It's really also embracing the limitations of the vine. So it's the balance between the limitless life force of the vine that has the potential to grow and explode and create new life, and also the tension of the limited ability for the branches to channel that energy into fruit. Because we like vines have a limited capacity with our energy and our attention, and we can't give a limited number of hours and energy and attention to a limitless number of things, right? I can't give my kids the attention they deserve while I'm on the email. We just have limits. And so it's recognizing and embracing those limits and coming to God, but with them and saying, okay, like one or two, what are the one or two branches that you want me to intentionally focus in this moment or in this season? And how can I let go of everything else and surrender? And it is an act of trust. It's an act of trust that it will grow, right?
Yes.
It's not something you see in the moment.
Yeah. So much goodness there, so much to learn from that whole process. And so just some words are coming to my mind from our conversation, just to summarize. Trust, surrender, waiting, right? Pruning, thinning, love, fruitfulness, indirection, contemplative, flourishing. There's a lot of good words here, and all of them, to stay on brand here, they're really all unhurried words, aren't they?
Yep.
I mean, it's another reason why we talk about living an unhurried life. Of course, we want people to do good things and allow God's love to flow through them to many people in all their spheres. Yes. Yes, and yes. And alongside of that is this invitation, this unhurried heart, unhurried spirit, unhurried mind, even that could see the goodness in what you're talking about and consent to this process.
Right.
I love the word process too, and be willing. Because sometimes, especially if you're a farmer or a gardener, you're relying on the rain and the sun and the weather and the wind. And in your book, there's a cool story about the moon. I mean, so, are we willing to trust that deeply? Right? Because what you're really painting is a beautiful picture of just the organic nature of this whole thing on a foundation of love.
Right.
So maybe that's an invitation I would throw out to people who are watching or listening would you just make one step toward consenting to whatever it means for you to take one step further in or higher up, whatever direction you want to go, deeper in, to what it would mean to just trust God a little bit more for the fruit that would be produced in your life. Just a little less striving, a little more open-handedness, just a little bit slower of a rev to hear more. There's so much. I knew that I was going to hate ending this conversation with you, Betty, because we've only just begun to talk about this. But maybe we could do it again sometime because there is more to talk about. But I'm wondering, is there anything that you'd like to say to people here at the end that you haven't said yet, that I didn't ask a question about, that you think is important for us to sort of take forward with us as we move?
I wonder actually if it would be good for me to read the benediction.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Because I think it kind of summarizes all the invitations and longings I would have.
Good.
So may you resist the impulse to generate fruit by your own strength, control, or performance, producing cheap wine that leaves those around you thirsty. Instead, may you find liberation from the demands of efficiency, quantity, and success, relaxing into the cultivation of a vine dresser who loves you and desires your flourishing. May you yield to his cultivation that is slow, relational, and for your good. The kind that nurtures something beautiful, something lasting from within you and the communion of saints across time and space. May your roots grow deep where you are planted. May the land and its history, the soil of your ancestors, the climate and the landscape of your surroundings fold you into their story, shaping a wine unique to your terroir. May you abide in the true vine, drawing from his abundant nourishment and life that sustains you in all seasons. May you surrender into his death and rise with his resurrection power bursting with abundance that springs from his life within. May you unfold into your truest self and uncover your belonging among the branches that shelter and protect you. May you be generously received in all your vulnerable beauty and receive the gift of others in a way that transforms you, cultivating the fruit that ripens through reciprocity. Together, may you bear the fruit of the kingdom, the kind that, when harvested and pressed, yields a wine of enduring quality, a wine that carries the flavor of Christ crushed in the winepress and poured out as a blessing for the world. When the cheap wine has run out, may the world taste its richness and say, they've saved the best for last. Amen.
Thank you so much, Betty. What a delight to be with you.
Thank you, Jem. It's an honor.
Thank you for joining me on the Unhurried Living podcast. You can download free resources and learn more about us at unhurriedliving.com. And please subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. We'd also like to thank our partner, Life Audio. Check out their other faith-centered podcasts at lifeaudio.com. Blessings to you as you make your way.